I didn't get a chance to mention this during the announcement time. It completely slipped my mind, and this isn't in your bulletin. We'll make sure it gets in there in the weeks to come. But the Sunday before Thanksgiving, I think that's November 19th. I think that's the date. It's that Sunday before Thanksgiving. That evening, here at the church, we're having a special worship service. Riverdale gives praise, Riverdale gives thanks, and we did something like this last year. And so it's a time just for us to come together to thank the Lord for all that He's done. We're going to sing together, worship together, and then afterwards there will be a time of fellowship, and we're going to have some sort of refreshment in the fellowship hall. And I do believe we're going to have that. How many of you have been here when we've had the mobile perk? You know, with the little coffee thing set out there, we're going to have them come back and do that as well. Okay, so that's going to be the Sunday before Thanksgiving, that evening, and we'll get all the times and all that in the bulletin, but I just wanted to make you aware of that. All right, we're going to be in 1 Samuel 18 this morning, so we're more than halfway through 1 Samuel. I don't even remember when we started this series, but we've been at it for a few months now, and we made it to chapter 18, and chapter 18 is full of firsts for David. It's full of firsts. In chapter 18, we see David's first real friend. In chapter 18, we meet David's first wife. In chapter 18, we read about Saul's first attempt on David's life. This chapter is full of firsts, and it's also full of contrasts. It's full of contrasts. In chapter 18, we see the beginning of David's meteoric rise to fame, but we also see the beginning of Saul's total demise. In chapter 18, we see how David seems to do everything right, and we see how Saul seems to get nothing right. We got through the first 16 verses of chapter 18 last week. I believe that's where we left off. In those verses, we read how Saul's son Jonathan became best friends with David. We saw how Jonathan made a covenant with David, an unconditional vow to serve and sacrifice and stick with David no matter what. We saw how Jonathan gave David his robe, his royal robe, which I believe signified Jonathan giving up his right to the throne. You know, Jonathan was heir to the throne of Israel. His father was the king. Jonathan was the firstborn son. He's the next in line, and yet Jonathan recognized that David is God's anointed, and so by giving David his royal robe, I believe he's essentially giving up his position to David. Jonathan, in addition to giving David his robe, he gave David his sword, his bow, his belt, his armor, pledging David his protection. I will be with you, David. I will fight for you, David. I'm in your corner. I got your back. While David has no idea of the difficulties that are just around the corner between he and Saul, God knew. And so God gave David a faithful friend to support him and walk with him through the deep valleys and the dark days ahead. And David would need Jonathan's friendship because Jonathan's father is going to turn on him. After David got done beating Goliath, he and Saul returned home to hear the marching band playing and the concert choir singing, and they sang, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000. Saul hears that and he loses it. Saul is not only aware that David has God's favor, but David also has the people's favor. And so Saul becomes consumed with jealousy and paranoia and rage. Of course, that was all intensified by the harmful spirit that was tormenting Saul. And not once, but twice, Saul tried to pin David to the wall with his spear. And both times, David escaped unharmed. And so while everybody in Saul's kingdom were fans of David, Saul himself feared David. Saul was terrified that David would steal the people's hearts. Saul was terrified that David would take his throne right out from under him. And so 1 Samuel 18:9 says that Saul eyed David from that day on. Now, what's funny to me is Saul earlier, Saul promised his daughter's hand in marriage to the guy who defeated Goliath. Of course, that was David, and so the man Saul has his eye on, the man Saul is suspicious of, is going to be his future son-in-law. Which, isn't it true of all fathers that they're at least a little suspicious of their future son-in-law? Is there a little truth to that? Well, Saul went beyond suspicion to attempted murder. So it's a little awkward, to say the least, when Saul's got to give his daughter over to the guy he tried to kill on 2 separate occasions. Look at verse 17. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife." So again, that was the promise Saul made to the man who took out Goliath. I will give my daughter's hand in marriage to that man. And guys, the whole army heard what Saul said. They all knew about the agreement because they were the ones to tell David about it when David showed up on the scene in the previous chapter. Well, Goliath's dead. David is the man who killed him, and it's not until now when Saul brings up the wedding to his daughter Merab. Again, verse 17, Saul said to David, "Here is my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." So Saul, he essentially says, David, here's my older daughter. You can marry her, but you still got to prove yourself. Goliath was a good start, but David, Goliath is just one Philistine. There's a lot more out there, and as long as there's Philistines, there's going to be battles. So David, I'm going to need to see you fight in some of these battles. If you show yourself valiant, my daughter Merab is all yours. See, Saul is hoping David will be killed in these battles. That's all he wants. And we know this because of how verse 17 ends. Do you see it? It says, "For Saul thought, let not my hand be against David, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." Okay, Saul's a sneak. He essentially, Saul is saying, this is a win-win for me. I mean, David is a warrior. There's no question about that. David is a warrior. I'm sure he'll be able to scratch out a few victories on the battlefield, which will mean less Philistines that I have to deal with. But sooner or later, David's going to get knocked off. I mean, David can't win every battle. That's statistically impossible. The Philistines will kill David for me. Which, guys, I got to wonder if David ran that exact same play back in his mind years later when he was king and he sent Bathsheba's husband Uriah out into battle to be killed so he could marry his wife, whom he got pregnant. See, David did to Uriah what Saul wanted to do to him. Like did David get that play from Saul? The deal was, David, you can marry my daughter, but before the wedding, you got to fight these battles and, hopefully die in these battles. And David said, verse 18, David said to Saul, "Who am I and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" Now, we've already seen in this series that Saul was about Saul. Saul was about Saul. In fact, he said back up in verse 17, Saul said, "David, be valiant for me." Saul was proud and selfish. "Be valiant for me." And David, he's the opposite. He says, "Who am I? Who am I that I should be son-in-law to the king?" We see David's humility on display here. Again, Saul was proud. Saul hated David because he saw David as a threat, and David is humble. And in spite of everything Saul has done, David still looked at Saul as his king. And David considered it an honor to be son-in-law to the king. However, at the time when Merab, look at verse 19, at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel, the Meholathite, for a wife. See, Saul was hoping that David would already be dead at this point. Saul was sure David would die in one of the battles, but it didn't happen. And so what Saul does is he changes his mind about Merab. How stable was Saul at this point? Right, very unstable, that harmful spirit was wreaking havoc in Saul. And so Saul changing his mind like he did, guys, that's just a sign of his disturbed nature. And so Saul gave Merab to another man, which, let me just ask you, did Saul care about what his daughter wanted? No, Saul only cares about himself, and his family were victims of his selfishness. Okay, when you are wrapped up in yourself, there's really no concern for anybody else. And sadly, many families, many women, many children are left broken and hurting in the wake of selfish men. Me first men. They're everywhere. The Bible says that when I was a child, I thought like a child. How does a child think? Right? How do they think? Well, when's it my birthday? Right? When's it going to be my turn? When are we going to do what I want? What does a child think about? Himself. When I was a child, the Bible says, I thought like a child, and I reasoned like a child. So how does a child reason? Right? What am I going to get out of it? What's in it for me? Will I like it? A child's world revolves around himself. He or she is quite often the center of his or her universe. Self-centered, self-focused, self-obsessed. Children can be extremely selfish. And so when I was a child, I thought like a child and I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, what did I do? Right? I put away childish things when I became a man. And sadly, a lot of husbands and a lot of fathers, a lot of men, they are still thinking and reasoning like children. I heard somebody say that a lot of men are really just little boys who shave. And that was Saul. He's a self-obsessed little boy, and everything is always about him, and he doesn't care about anybody else. Think of his poor daughter Merab. At first, Saul uses her as a bargaining chip to try to get anybody, to take on Goliath. Then Saul promises her hand in marriage to David, but like some lottery pick in the draft, Saul trades her to some other guy named Adriel. She's just a pawn in Saul's immature little game. Men were young only once, but some are immature for life. And Saul needs to grow up. He's a man, but he has not put away childish things. Look at verse 20. Now Saul's daughter, his other daughter, Michal, she loved David. So Saul's goal of excluding David from the royal family is falling apart because he's got another daughter, Michal, and she loves David. Last week we learned how Saul's son and Saul's soldiers and Saul's servants loved David. Now we see his daughter loves David. Everyone but Saul loves David. Everybody but Saul loves David. So Saul, if you're the only one in the whole kingdom who doesn't love David, maybe you're the problem. His daughter Michal loved David, and his servants told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So you can almost picture Saul when he hears how his daughter feels about David. You can almost see the Grinch smile come across his face. Right? This big old crooked, sinister smirk comes upon Saul's face as he thought. Verse 21, Saul thought, well, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore, Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. So to keep trying the same thing and expect different results, that is the definition of insanity. And that is Saul. He's like, okay, I'm going to give the Philistines another shot at knocking off David. This time, Saul was hoping his daughter Michal would turn David into a softie. My sweet little daughter, her love for David will distract him, and he will lose focus, and he will fall in battle, and I'll be back on top. Hey, you know what, David? I changed my mind. I actually got another daughter. You can marry her and be my son-in-law. So Saul cares nothing for his daughter or David. Saul sees Michal as a means to an end, and the end was for David to be dead and gone. Saul used Michal to abuse David. In fact, Saul commanded his servants, verse 22, Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. And so Saul's servants spoke these words in the ears of David, and David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation? David's like, why would Saul want me to be his son-in-law when I have no money, no nobility? Why would the king want me to be his son-in-law when I have nothing? That's a good question to ask. Why? Well, maybe, David, maybe it's because Saul's up to something. Well, those servants went and told Saul what David said. Look at verse 24. And the servants said of Saul, and the servants of Saul told him thus, and so did David speak. Then Saul said, thus shall you say to David, the king desires no bride price. So unlike today where the bride's parents pay for the wedding, in Bible times it was the groom. It was the groom and his family's responsibility. The groom would give a gift to the parents of the bride to offset their loss of their daughter. And the payment would have been precious metals, it would have been livestock, and since David was going to marry a princess, the bride price would have been a lot steeper than usual. And there's no way David could swing it, because his dad is an old farmer from Bethlehem. They're poor. They do have some sheep, but not enough to cover the cost of a princess. And so Saul said, the king desires no bride price. Now here comes the Grinch smile. The king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines. First of all, what? And second of all, gross. And I'm just going to say it's a whole lot easier to talk about the severed head of Goliath than 100 foreskins of the Philistines. It's an awkward subject. So try my best to make it less weird. Basically, Saul says to David, if you're struggling to come up with a bride price, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. All I want is a little revenge on the Philistines. I'm not asking for precious metals or a ton of cattle. Just knock off, 100 Philistines. Bring back their foreskins to me as proof, and we'll call it even. I think this may have been their version of scalping. The foreskins would prove to Saul that A, 100 men had been killed, and B, the 100 men were Philistines, since everybody else in the area were Jews, and they had been circumcised. Clear? All in favor of moving on? Okay. How many Philistines did Saul ask David to kill before he could marry Michal? 100. Not an easy task. Not a quick task. Because the Philistines, we've already seen this, what they would do, their practice was to set up garrisons of soldiers, these little detachments of soldiers numbering 10, 20, 30 men. They would be stationed all over the land of Israel. And so to kill 100 men, David would have to take on a few garrisons. Again, not quick, not easy. Saul is hoping that David would take on one garrison too many. The end of verse 25 says, now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So just think about this for a second. Saul cares nothing for David. That's been very clear. It's been obvious. He cares nothing for David. He wants David dead. But in wanting David dead, Saul proves that he cares nothing for his daughter Michal, who loves David. Saul proves that he cares nothing for his son Jonathan, who's best friends with David. Saul is willing to destroy the lives of his own family to get what he wants. Saul put himself first every single time. Saul put himself before others. And guys, the way of selfishness, the way of Saul, is me before you. The way of love is you before me. What way are you taking with your spouse, with your kids, with your parents, with your siblings, with your people? Is it always me before you? That is the opposite of love. Don't say you love when it's always me before you. True biblical agape love is you before me. It's the way of Jonathan, who put David before himself. If I were to ask your spouse, your kids, your parents, your siblings, the people who know you best, if I were to ask them about you, is it me before you or you before me, what answer would they give? Do you come first or do they come first? Saul always put himself first, before his daughter, before his son, before David, before his nation. The very person his son, daughter, and nation loved, Saul wants to kill him because he is jealous. David, you want to marry my daughter who loves you and adores you and just can't wait to spend her life with you? Go kill 100 Philistines and then we'll talk. Well, when David heard those words, verse 26, when Saul's servants told David those words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Wow. After everything Saul's done to David, he's already tried to kill David twice with his spear. Saul then lied to David about his first daughter. You can marry her. Oops, I changed my mind. I gave her to somebody else. Saul plotted against David, put him on the front line so the Philistines will kill him for me. After all that, David still loved, served, and respected Saul as king. Verse 26, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. What I need you to take away from that is David did not retaliate with the same hostility or animosity. What good would that have done? David still looked at Saul as God's anointed. And David knew, this is important, David knew that God works on more than one heart at a time. Maybe God is working on Saul's heart. Maybe Saul is having a change of heart, and David was not going to let any hostility or animosity towards Saul get in the way. James 1:20 says that the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Remember that, church. The wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. If you got a Saul in your life, maybe there's been somebody who's been lying to you, plotting against you. Maybe somebody has tried or is currently trying to hurt you. Let me ask you, can God change their heart? Can God change them? Yeah. But will your retaliation, revenge, animosity, hostility, will that help or hinder what God can do? It's going to hinder, it's going to hurt it, because the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. So if God was going to go to work on Saul's heart, David didn't know if God would or wouldn't. The fact is, guys, God already gave Saul over to a debased mind. But David didn't know that. David didn't know that. We don't know if God's done the same with the people who hate us and hurt us. All we know is God can change anybody. And so David was not going to get in the way of that with any of his own expressed animosity or hostility toward Saul. And so when Saul's servants, back to verse 26, when Saul's servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law before the time had expired. So Saul, he apparently put a time limit on when David could kill the 100 Philistines and then marry his daughter. So before the time had expired, verse 27, David arose and went along with his men and killed 200 of the Philistines. So David thought Michal was worth not just 100, but 200 foreskins. Isn't that sweet? And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. How shocked was Saul to see David return? Yeah, like his plan to off David did not work. And here's why. Here's why. Because God had purposed that David would be king. Okay? And God's purpose supersedes man's plan every single time. Proverbs 19:21, I love this verse. It says, many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. I like how the New Living Translation puts it. It says, you can make many plans, but the Lord's purpose prevails. Okay, what was Saul's plan? Kill David. What was God's purpose? To crown David. What prevails? God's purpose. And so God gave David victory over twice as many Philistines that Saul asked for. Do you understand? No plot, no plan, no person, no problem will ever prevent God's purpose. David, he thought Michal was worth 200 Philistines. And so he pays double the bride price. And Saul, he's so mad. Look at how verse 27 ends. And Saul gave David his daughter Michal for a wife, like the most miserable father of the bride ever. Not even the legendary wedding planner Frank Egelhofer could fix this. Okay? How many of you have seen Father of the Bride? Okay, Martin Short played Frank, and he was eccentric to say the least. Instead of Saul walking Michal down the aisle, Michal, I would imagine, walked Saul down the aisle. She dragged him down the aisle. Who gives this woman to be married to this man? Right? And Saul, through clenched teeth, says, her mother and I. When Saul, verse 28, but when he saw and knew that the Lord was with David and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Now, leading up to this point, Saul's hatred of David kind of ebbed and flowed. Saul's hatred, it would come, it would go, but now it's here to stay. Now Saul hated David all the time. He was David's enemy, the text says, continually, around the clock. But the Lord was with David. David had God's favor, right? He had God's favor, and he had Saul's anger. The former is stronger than the latter. I don't know about you, but I would much rather receive man's anger in God's favor than God's anger in man's favor. Okay, man can kill the body, but God can destroy both body and soul. So I am okay, I am totally fine with living with God's favor and man's anger if I have to. Guys, again, Saul was David's enemy continually. Saul's insatiable pride of having to be the best drove him to insane jealousy and hatred of David, and instead of rejoicing in the fact, Saul, instead of rejoicing in the fact that he now had a son-in-law whom the Lord was with and whom his daughter loved and whom his kingdom respected, what father wouldn't want that kind of man for his daughter? Right? Like, I got a daughter, and even now her mother and I pray for her to marry a man who's after God's own heart, just like David. And that's what Saul had for his daughter, but he couldn't see it. David's love and grace enabled him to see his enemy as family. It pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. David's love and grace enabled him to see his enemy as family, but Saul's jealousy and hate drove him to see family as his enemy. How do you see people? What lens are you looking through? The lens of love and grace or the lens of jealousy and hate? There might be some of you here this morning who need new glasses. Look at verse 30. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, which really ticked Saul off even more. So Saul is still sending David out into battle, hoping the Philistines will finish him off. The only difference is David is now his son-in-law. You know, I love how we see the sovereignty of God here. Okay, God is in control even over wicked men who secretly plot wicked schemes. Saul kept putting David on the front lines, hoping David would be killed in action, and yet God used Saul's wicked scheme to give David great success. All right, let me repeat what you guys already know. God is so sovereign. He is so in control of everyone and everything that he can take the awful things people do and bring good out of it. Okay, he works out all things together for the good of those who love him. And David loved God. And God not only gave David greater success than everybody, including Saul, but look at how chapter 18 ends. The last line of verse 30 says, David's name was highly esteemed. You know, in those days, a leader of a nation, the king, he would garner people's respect through his great military abilities and his great military victories. David had the abilities, and now he's racking up the victories. And the people noticed, and David had their respect. And I mentioned this last Sunday, and I'll just bring it up again in closing. The secret to David's success is the Lord was with him. Okay, and everybody, including Saul, saw that and knew that. Again, if you look at verse 28, it says, but when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David. Okay, you got to think, just for a moment, think of where David came from. A farmer's home in Bethlehem. David, the youngest of 8, he tended sheep, he played the harp. And so for a harp-playing shepherd, son of a farmer, for him to be the warrior and the commander that he was, it's only because God was working in him and through him. And guys, the only reason for David's success is the only reason for our success. Okay, it's God and God alone. God does it, God grants it. And so instead of responding with pride by taking all the credit for ourselves, may we respond with humility by thanking God and praising God for what he does. And guys, here's another thing. When we see other people, right? When we see other people serving well and experiencing success, instead of responding with jealousy by seeing them as the competition and looking for ways to criticize them, may we respond with humility by thanking God and praising God for what he does. Okay? Moving forward, just so you know, just kind of set the scene for what's to come. Moving forward, Saul is no longer going to keep his plans to kill David a secret. Right, up to this point, Saul's been very busy behind the scenes, plotting. You know, hey, go fight these battles to prove yourself valiant so you can be my son-in-law. Right, go kill 100 Philistines so you can marry my daughter. Saul's hidden desire was for David to die in one of those battles. It was all the secret. Moving forward, Saul is going to be open and obvious and public with his desire to kill David. And for David, think about it, for David, wouldn't it have been so much better if Saul just came alongside of David and encouraged him and mentored him? Wouldn't it have been better for David to just ascend to the throne without the problems? Not exactly. See, listen, one of my commentaries says the kind of people, this is important, the kind of people we are is determined not just by the friendships we make, but by how we deal with the enemies we are given. Okay, the kind of people we are is determined not just by the friendships we make, but by how we deal with the enemies we are given. Okay, David, he has been enjoying God's presence with him in his victories. Now, David is going to have to find that same God in persecution and eventually in exile. Okay, that is all coming in the chapters ahead, so stay tuned. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father, thank you again for this time that you've given us to be in your word and study the life of David. And there's just so many principles we can take from this and apply to our lives. First of all, God, I pray that we would all be convicted over the selfishness that can rear its ugly head in our lives. God, I think of how selfish I can be. God, I think of how often I can be me before others. And my family has seen that, and other people have seen that, and it just, it destroys, it devastates, it breaks down relationships. And so, God, I pray that you would convict us of our selfishness. Lord, that you would remove the desire to always put ourselves before other people. God, that you would deal with that you would break us of that you would bring us to repentance. And if there's people that have been hurt in the wake of that, God, may we go to them and apologize and ask for forgiveness and make it right. God, we don't want to be like Saul. We want to be more like Jonathan, Jonathan put David first. May we put others first. And God, I thank you for just how sovereign you are. We see your sovereignty in chapter 18, how Saul, he had his plans and he tried to do David harm, but God, you overruled all of that. And your plan was for David to be king, and that's exactly what was going to happen. And God, we just come away from that confident that nothing and no one can thwart your plan, your purpose. We find us and we may think that things are out of control and things are chaotic, but God, nothing is out of control because everything is always in your control. We thank you for that. We thank you for the peace that gives us, Lord. May we walk in that peace. It's in Jesus' name.